Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, and I do hope that you're exceedingly well and that you've had the most phenomenal day, because you deserve to have had a lovely day. And before you settle down and get lovely and cosy with that warm hot cup of cocoa, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And by the way, I do send all my love to each and every one of you. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I have two very airy encounters that happened to me. One was supernatural and the other was related to the hairy man, otherwise known as Bigfoot. And in a strange, curious, rather peculiar way, you could say that they happened simultaneously, well, more or less. My story begins in the early June of 2003, when my mother was purchasing a rather grand property that was one of 17 other homes in a private cul-de-sac in a very upmarket, serene neighbourhood. The old Victorian-style houses had all but been bulldozed and replaced with these new Tuscan two-storey homes that were open plan, very palatial and very grand and spacious. It was conveniently located in the countryside, with the nearest town only 20 minutes away, so it really was rather idyllic. To access the property, you would drive through this beautifully stunning landscaped stone entrance with a large backdrop of towering, majestic, mature oak trees and plenty of acres of emerald green space that you could explore, including a secluded wooded area of natural wilderness and beautiful tall trees that they were considering actually bulldozing in the not too distant future, with the intention of building new homes there, rather like the Tuscan development that we were moving into. My mother had purchased the property on the spot, as she was an impulsive buyer, and she claimed to have fallen in love with the place at first sight. My father had little say in the matter, so what my mother wanted she invariably always got, and she ruled our house with an iron rod. I still remember the day I moved into the house as if it was yesterday. I was 18 at the time, and my brother Chris was only 16. The moment our white Mercedes-Benz pulled up to the property, my mother was literally oohing and ahhing about how magnificently palatial it all was and how impressed all her friends were going to be. But my father and I, we never said a word. We sat there in silence. I do not know how to explain this to you, but the place, although rich and grand and luxurious, was both menacing, cold and creepy. And I got the very strange impression that something or someone was watching us from the second-story window, and the energy they appeared to exude was ominous and oppressive, like a dark, heavy, depressed thunder cloud that retains all its watery sorrows. I regarded the uncomfortable expression on my poor father's face, and I knew almost immediately that he felt it too. "Isn't it absolutely magnificent?" my mother enthused, and I could see my poor father plant a plastic, somewhat erroneous smile on his poor face and try to look as excited as he could, but it was a very big struggle for him. "Lovely, dear," he said in a very flat voice. The removal van arrived and proceeded to place our furniture in strategic areas around the lavish mansion, under the direct supervision of my excitable mother, who ordered everyone around like a formidable headmistress, and you could see she was in her element. I heard one of the removal men say to his friend, "There is something not right about this home. It feels very haunted." The other guy nodded. "It gives me the creeps. It's got such a heavy, sinister vibe about it." I was gratified to hear an outside authority share their same misgivings about the place, confirming to myself that I wasn't completely barking mad, and that other people had physically sensed the negative energy of this place. I started to unpack my boxes in my room, which was the room with the most unwelcome ambience in the entire house. It was an energy of such deep, formidable hopelessness and despair, and it enveloped me with an icy frostiness that literally caused my entire body to shiver with the cold. My mother emerged in the room like a bright butterfly landing on a block of ice. Her joyful countenance was filled with exuberant enthusiasm and colourful energy as she boldly declared how perfectly wonderful my cold, austere bedroom actually was. My mother rambled on and on and on about all the accessories she planned to use to transform my room into a bright, brash, pink princess bedroom. In truth, I barely heard a word she said. All I could think about was that there definitely was an unseen presence in my bedroom that was so palpable I could feel it. It was so real. It felt as if someone had actually died in my bedroom and not too far away. It felt as if maybe they had died in the more recent Victorian development that preceded this new development that we were now actually living in. I was almost 100% certain that this was indeed the case. It had to be. Nothing else made any sense. After all, did not all land hold on to energy signatures of previously deceased tenants or owners? I was almost certain that was true. "Lisa, are you listening?" asked my mother with a look of infuriation on her highly made-up face. "Who did you say lived here before when it was a Victorian home?" I asked her. "I've no idea, darling. You do ask the strangest questions sometimes." I did notice that from the moment we moved into our home, curiously strange and peculiar things began to happen very, very suddenly, and even my somewhat bemused, rather insensitive mother did start to notice them too. "Who keeps taking my car keys out of my handbag and putting them into the freezer?" she would ask. "It's not funny," she said, eyeing my brother with a look of suspicion on her face. Other strange things happened too, like we would smell cigarette smoke wafting in the house, and my mother was absolutely convinced my brother was secretly smoking behind her back. She was furious with him. "I told you, I cannot abide such a disgusting, vile and revolting habit," she would say. "Mum, I'm not smoking," protested my brother innocently. "Don't lie to me," scolded my mother. Then there was a time that my mother found a large handprint on her chocolate mousse that was setting in the fridge, and once again she hurled her accusations at my brother, reprimanding him ever so severely. "What is it about you? Since we've moved into this house, you are hiding all my things, smoking cigarettes behind my back, ruining all my beautiful, delicious puddings. You're deliberately trying to annoy me and make me very upset. It's like you're contemptuously ridiculing me and getting your kicks out of it at my expense. I assure you, I am not amused by any of this." As my brother was protesting his innocence, suddenly we heard a loud, audible chuckle. And it was not coming from any of us, let me tell you. My mother looked incensed and stormed out of the room, incandescent with rage. "You kids, and all your pranks, you're wearing me down," she snapped. "I've just had about enough as I can take of the lot of you." I did try to tell my mother that there was a ghostly presence in our house that was just toying with her, but she told me that I was barking mad and that there was no such things as ghosts. "Tell them, dear," she said, looking at my father. As usual, my father was as quiet as a church mouse, but just to appease my mother and to keep the peace, he did his dutiful duty, as was always the case. "Your mother's very right. There is nothing here." But the expression on his face did tell a very different story. One night I was returning to bed with a cup of cocoa in my hands when I smelt the very distinct odour of cigarette smoke. I almost choked because it was so strong. The door to my bedroom was ajar, and then I saw him. There was a young man, possibly about 18 or so, with short, spiky brown hair, wearing a green plaid shirt, sitting on the edge of my bed, smoking a cigarette. I even remember the pout to his lips when he blew out the whirls of white smoke into long tunnels of curly smoke. I did not know if the young man knew that I was there in those first few seconds, that I stood just gaping at him. I could hardly believe what I was actually witnessing with my eyes. For a moment it was as if time just stood still. And then he looked up, and our eyes met. And he smiled, and then in a flash he was gone, just like that. It happened so incredibly quickly. One moment he was there, and then he was gone. But the smell of pungent cigarette still lingered after him in the air. I bolted down the stairs as fast as I possibly could to tell my mother that I'd seen a ghost, and she became enraged and told me to stop telling porky pies. When she did this, there was another out-of-worldly chuckle. But my mother thought it was me laughing at her. She became furious and told me to stop messing around with her and making up all these ghost stories to scare her. This is a new housing development, she scolded. If it were ghosts were real, they certainly wouldn't be hanging around a brand new place like this. And then I heard another chuckle. That night I went to bed, absolutely terrified. I was so frightened that that ghost would reappear again. I knew he was harmless, but I was not comfortable seeing something supernatural in my home, let alone my bedroom. And besides, I had heard horrible stories before about ghosts turning nasty or not being what they first appeared to be. The next evening, when I was in the adjoining bathroom brushing my teeth, my mother came into my bedroom with a cup of cocoa in her hands, and sitting on the bed was the male ghost smoking a cigarette. I heard a crashing sound as my mother dropped the cocoa that she had for me in utter horror on the floor. I came out of the bathroom and I saw that she had locked eyes with the ghost. The look of terror on my mother's face was literally unforgettable. I do not think she could believe what she was actually seeing. The ghost made a chuckling sound and then was gone in a flash of light, and my mother started to scream. Ah! Long after the ghost had vaporized, she was still screaming. Ah! My mother wasted no time in calling over a paranormal team to eliminate the ghost immediately, and the paranormal investigator told her that to get rid of ghosts was not the same as getting rid of rodents or rats or roaches, and that things needed to be done much more sensitively than that. My mother told the team to leave because she wanted our ghost gone as soon as was conceivably possible, and if they couldn't get rid of it now, then she would call someone else. And that's what she did. That was when she called the help of a well-known psychic, a lady by the name of Cynthia. The lady arrived very promptly, and my mother literally ordered her to get rid of the ghost immediately. He must be gone, she insisted. How am I ever going to be able to shower again with him loitering around the place? For all I know, he may be a peeping Tom, and he may have been watching and spying on me all the time while I was getting dressed. At this rate, I will never be able to change my clothes ever again. I will end up smelling like a skunk. I may never be able to bath with him around. I have no intention of being eye candy for a ghost. I'm sure it will not come to that, said the psychic very kindly to my mother. I'm sure we can get him to leave, but we need to find out why he's here in the first place. The psychic managed to connect with the ghost, who told her that his name was Christopher and that he had lived in the old Victorian house only a few years prior, before it had been bulldozed and transformed into a new development. He said he had hung himself in the closet and his mother had returned home to find him hanging there, and he was so torn up about what he'd done with so much guilt and regret because he'd caused her so much devastating pain. He had tried to reach out to her, but she had been so full of grief that she had failed to see him. And he wanted her to know that he was so sorry at what he'd done and that he really loved her, and that he wanted her to know this before he actually moved on into the next world. And so it was the psychic did contact the previous owner of the former woman who lived in the house and passed over the message to the young woman, who was so happy to get the message. Then she proceeded to cleanse our home by smoking our entire home with sage, but everything she did just could not convince my mother that the ghost had actually gone. So she would go to her local health club and have showers there, because she was absolutely convinced that the Snoopy ghost was still around. While she was at her health club, she met a lady who informed her that salt needed to be placed on every corner of the property to keep the ghost at bay. And I kid you not, the back of my mother's car boot was literally loaded and packed with hundreds and hundreds of bags of salt. And I was the one relegated to putting salt around every area of the premises, much to the annoyance of the landscape gardeners, who asked me what on earth I was doing with all these massive amounts of salt. I did tell them I was getting rid of a ghost in our house, and they both cracked up laughing. It was on a Friday afternoon that, armed with a few kilos of salt, I entered the wooded area, and I was impressed by how magnificently beautiful it was, as there were towering mature oaks, maples and pine trees, and they were so majestic and beautiful. I could detect all kinds of animal scat on the forest floor, which I knew suggested that this magical place was indeed a haven for all kinds of wild animals, which was a very exciting thought. I could not help thinking that it would be a travesty to tear down this glorious forest to make way for a brand new development. A chipmunk was watching me with a curious interest as I ventured deeper into the forest. Suddenly I noticed some tree branches had been twisted into circular shapes and at peculiar angles, and it looked very strange and rather menacing. I didn't know what it could be, but I was quite interested. After a while I heard a very strange sound in the woods, and the only way I can describe it was that it sounded like a dog was rolling around in the grass. I moved towards the curious noise, and I saw what I thought looked like a bear rolling on its back, which it was rubbing vigorously on the forest floor, almost like it was giving itself a lovely, long, sensuous body scrub. I realised suddenly that this creature was not a bear at all, because it had long, hairy black arms with dark hands and flat human-like nails, and the hair-covered body was very colossal, much larger than that of a black bear. What on earth was this curious, strange thing, I wondered, that was behaving exactly like a dog and clearly enjoying himself very much? Suddenly I wanted to sneeze, and I was absolutely mortified because I did not want this creature to see me, standing right there. But out came my sneeze in full force, possibly due to my hay fever, and it was beyond my control. The creature sat up and looked around with a concerned look in its deep-set brown eyes, and bounced up immediately on its long, agile legs, fixing a steely gaze upon me. I could see by his pained expression on his leathery brown face that he was not at all happy that I had observed him like this, and that he had been caught off guard. I stood there in terror regarding this creature, in utter horror. I promise you, being close to a creature as imposing and as powerful as this thing was like being in a tiger's den. You pretty much think you're already living on borrowed time, and that death is imminent. In that moment I did not know whether to run or to stand still. I have never been more afraid in my entire life, and my legs were shaking violently beneath me, and my heart was thundering through my chest at 100 miles an hour. The creature looked at me, curled back his mouth, exposing his glistening white, pearly teeth, and made a strange, audible, growling sound that sounded very menacing, like an aggressive Rottweiler dog. And then he gave me 1 or 2 more glances with his brown eyes, and ran off on his long, hairy legs with the most incredible agility and grace. I was so relieved to see the creature go, but I could not believe what my eyes had physically seen. This creature must have been about 7 to 8 feet tall, 500 to 600 pounds, and covered with long, lustrous black hair, and it was rather matted, but it had a face that was just like that of an ape, but also human influences in it, and a very distinctive, very crinkled brow ridge, a dark, flat nose, and a typical ape-like mouth. I ran back to my mother as fast as I could to tell her what I'd seen. "Mum, there's an ape! There's an ape-man in the woods, and he was rolling on the ground just like a dog. There was an ape in the woods, Mum, and he was like a dog rolling in the ground." "Lisa, what's wrong with you?" my mother shrieked. "Stop making up these crazy stories. There are no apes in America, for goodness sake. Why do you insist on trying to scare your poor mother? It's amazing that I've not had a cardiac arrest with all the comings and goings lately. Did you put the salt on the edges of the woods or did you not? She asked, looking at me with a very suspicious look on her face. Of course I did, I said, knowing full well that I hadn't. What was the point of putting kilos and kilos of salt in their packages all around the forest floor? But what my mother did not know was not going to hurt her, because layering salt everywhere was not going to ward off ghosts, in my opinion. I was sad that I could not share my amazing encounter with the ape-like humanoid that I'd met in the woods, because no one believed my story, and even my own brother, who knows I do not lie, just refused to believe me, and told me that after my encounter with the ghost, I was now seeing things and manifesting them in my imagination, which definitely was not the case. I know what I saw in those woods, and it was a hairy, ape-like humanoid. I kid you not, days after my mother's encounter with a ghost, despite the fact that the house felt light and airy, and there were no ghostly pranks being performed anymore, and no strange laughter in the house, none of that mattered. My mother was totally convinced that the ghost was hiding in her closet, eager to watch her getting dressed. I did try and tell my mother that I knew that he was gone, but the more I insisted that she had nothing to worry about, the more contrary my mother became, insisting that she had sensed that the ghost was spying on her and was hiding in her closet, convinced that he was following her to the health club as well. She told us that while she was washing her hair in the shower, the shampoo bottle had mysteriously fallen over, and she ran out of the shower screaming, believing that the ghost had been in the shower with her. She did call the psychic to investigate the shower at the health club, much to the manager's disapproval and horror of all the gym members. The psychic assured her that the ghost had well and truly gone and had not followed her to the gym, but my mother insisted that the psychic saged the whole shower area, including the shower that she had been in. When some of the ladies looked shocked about the lengths my mother was going to, my mother informed the bystanders that they should be grateful because she was eliminating an invisible peeping Tom from the premises. And so it was my mother put our property on the market all over again, and we moved into a rented property until my mother found us another home, and she also found a new health club that she was certain was no longer haunted by the peeping Tom. I'm glad to report that there has been no paranormal activity in our new place that we bought. It was a few years after that I was to discover that the extraordinary creature I had seen in the woods was actually a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, and I was amazed that there were people like me who had reported sightings of this unusual creature, so I was not completely alone in my experience, I am glad to say. Well, thank you so much for that really lovely story. I just loved it. I do love your mother. I mean, just like I love cantankerous old men in stories, I love your mother believing that everywhere she went, that the ghost was in the shower with her, that the ghost was in the shower at the gym. I can't imagine how hilarious it must have been when she ran out of the shower because she thought that the ghost was in there with her, and all the gym memberships were looking at her as she calls in the psychic to literally make sure that the ghost has indeed gone and hasn't been following her everywhere. I loved that. Until next time, goodbye and good night.